Harlem, New York, the corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue. Friday night, August 9th, 1968. The heart of Harlem, where street life never stopped, where people gathered on corners and in front of shops and outside bars and restaurants, where music spilled from open windows and from car radios, where the atmosphere on warm summer nights was alive with conversation and laughter, and the energy that characterized Harlem when the neighborhood was at its most vibrant, when people were out enjoying the evening, when the streets were full of life that made Harlem feel like a community rather than just a collection of buildings. On the corner, standing outside a small grocery store that was owned by one of his associates, stood Frank Lucas, 38 years old, already one of the most successful heroin distributors in New York, someone who'd built an empire by importing pure product directly from Southeast Asia and selling it wholesale to organized crime families throughout the city, someone whose wealth and power made him effectively untouchable by normal law enforcement methods, someone who'd earned respect throughout Harlem, not just through money and violence, but through his demonstrated willingness to defend his reputation against anyone who challenged it, regardless of their position or authority. Lucas was dressed casually but expensively, wearing clothes that cost more than most people in Harlem. Made in a month, but that didn't advertise wealth in obvious ways. Talking with 3 associates about business matters that required face-to-face conversation rather than phone discussions that might be monitored. Conducting his affairs openly on Harlem streets, because Lucas believed that being visible demonstrated power, that hiding suggested weakness, that criminals who ran their operations from behind closed doors were criminals who were afraid of their own neighborhoods. The evening was proceeding normally, unremarkably. Another Friday night in Harlem, where business was conducted and where Lucas maintained his presence on streets he considered his territory. But at 9:17 p.m., everything changed. A police car turned onto 116th Street, driving slowly, 2 white officers inside, scanning the street with a kind of aggressive attention that suggested they were looking for something specific, that they had purpose beyond just routine patrol, that they were intending to make their presence felt in ways that went beyond simply maintaining order. The police car stopped directly in front of where Lucas was standing, the officers having obviously recognized him, having clearly decided that finding Frank Lucas on a street corner provided an opportunity to assert police authority in ways that would demonstrate to everyone watching that law enforcement wasn't intimidated by Lucas's reputation or his wealth or his power within Harlem's criminal community. The 2 officers exited their vehicle, both wearing uniforms that gave them legitimate authority, but that also made them immediately identifiable as outsiders in Harlem, as representatives of a system that many residents viewed with suspicion or hostility, as people whose presence often meant harassment or arrest rather than protection or service. The lead officer was Sergeant Michael O'Brien, 42 years old, a 20-year veteran of the NYPD who'd spent most of his career in predominantly white neighborhoods, but who'd recently been reassigned to Harlem as part of department efforts to increase police presence in areas experiencing high crime rates, someone who'd brought attitudes and assumptions about race and authority that created constant friction with communities he was supposedly serving. O'Brien's partner was Officer Thomas Walsh, younger and less experienced, but equally committed to the kind of aggressive policing that viewed black neighborhoods as enemy territory. To be pacified rather than as communities to be protected, that saw residents as potential criminals, rather than as citizens deserving respect, that used police authority as weapon to intimidate and control rather than as tool to maintain order and ensure safety. O'Brien walked directly toward Lucas, his body language aggressive and confrontational, making it clear that this wasn't a friendly interaction or a routine check, but was instead a deliberate assertion of authority, designed to challenge Lucas in front of the crowd that had gathered on the corner, that was now watching this encounter with increasing tension, because everyone present understood that confrontations between police and Lucas rarely ended without someone being humiliated or hurt or arrested. "Frank Lucas," O'Brien said, his voice loud enough that everyone on the corner could hear, loud enough that this was clearly intended as public theater rather than as private conversation. Well, look who's standing on my corner conducting his drug business in the open like he owns the street. You think being a successful criminal means you can just operate publicly without consequences. You think the NYPD is going to let you sell your poison right here in the open where everyone can see? Lucas looked at O'Brien with an expression that showed no fear, no concern about police authority, just cold calculation about whether this officer was about to create a situation that would require response, that would force Lucas to either submit to public humiliation or to react in ways that would have serious consequences. "Officer O'Brien," Lucas said, his voice calm and controlled, "I'm standing on a public street having a conversation with some friends. I'm not conducting any illegal business. I'm not bothering anyone. So unless you've got probable cause to arrest me or some legitimate police reason for this conversation, I'd suggest you get back in your car and continue your patrol elsewhere." O'Brien's face flushed red, angry at being addressed by Lucas, in a tone that suggested equality rather than the deference that O'Brien expected from people he was questioning. Angry that Lucas had used his name, suggesting that Lucas knew who he was and had possibly been tracking his activities or his patrol patterns. Angry, most of all, that Lucas wasn't showing the fear or respect that O'Brien believed his police authority entitled him to receive. "You'd suggest," O'Brien said, his voice rising, his anger becoming more visible. "You'd suggest what I should do? Let me tell you something, Lucas. I don't take suggestions from drug dealers. I don't take orders from criminals who think they're above the law. And I especially don't take direction from uppity N-words who've forgotten their place in this city's hierarchy. You're a criminal, Lucas. You're garbage. You're someone we're going to put in prison where you belong. And when we do, you're going to learn what happens to people who think being successful at crime makes them important." The street went absolutely silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Music that had been playing from nearby windows seemed to fade into background. Everyone within earshot, approximately 50 people on that corner, and on nearby stoops and on the street, stopped what they were doing and turned to watch because Sergeant O'Brien had just publicly used racial slurs against Frank Lucas, had called him the N-word in front of dozens of witnesses, had deliberately humiliated him in ways that went beyond just asserting police authority into territory of racial disrespect that everyone understood was dangerous. That created situations that couldn't be resolved through normal means, that demanded response because not responding would mean accepting degradation that no one with power would tolerate. Lucas didn't react immediately. He simply looked at O'Brien with the same cold expression that Vincent Albano had seen at the 21 Club, that Thomas McCarthy had seen at the Regency Hotel. The expression that meant Lucas was making calculations about whether this person deserved to die, and if so, how that death should be accomplished in ways that sent messages beyond just eliminating one individual who'd made the mistake of disrespecting him. "Sergeant O'Brien," Lucas said, his voice so quiet that people had to strain to hear, so controlled that it suggested massive effort to contain rage that wanted to explode into immediate violence. "You just made a very serious mistake. You used that word. You called me that in front of all these people. You deliberately humiliated me, using language that you know is designed to degrade and disrespect, and you did it because you think your police badge protects you from consequences, because you think being white and being a cop means you can say anything to anyone without facing retaliation." Lucas continued, his voice still quiet, but now carrying something that made Officer Walsh instinctively step backward, made O'Brien's hand move toward his service weapon, made everyone watching understand that they were witnessing the moment before violence, the calm before reaction. "I'm going to give you 10 seconds to get back in your car and leave this corner. 10 seconds to apologize for what you just said. 10 seconds to demonstrate that you understand you just crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. If you're still standing here after 10 seconds, if you haven't apologized, then what happens next is entirely your responsibility. 10, 9, 8. O'Brien should have left. Should have recognized that he'd made a catastrophic error by using racial slurs against one of the most powerful and dangerous criminals in Harlem. Should have understood that his police badge wouldn't protect him from retaliation if he continued this confrontation. Should have gotten back in his car and driven away before the situation escalated beyond the point where peaceful resolution was possible. But O'Brien, like so many people before him, who'd underestimated Frank Lucas, or who'd let pride override survival instinct, made the worst decision. He laughed, a loud theatrical laugh designed to show everyone watching that he wasn't intimidated by Lucas's threat, that police authority trumped criminal power, that Lucas's countdown was meaningless theater from someone who wouldn't dare attack a police officer in front of dozens of witnesses. "You're threatening a police officer," O'Brien said, still laughing, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You're actually threatening me? That's assault on an officer, Lucas. That's a felony. You just gave me cause to arrest you. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. You're going to jail. And while you're sitting in a cell, you can think about what happens to N-words who forget that white cops run this city and that all your drug money doesn't change that fundamental fact." Lucas stopped counting. He looked at O'Brien for 5 long seconds, then spoke one more time before turning and walking away. "You had your chance to apologize. You chose to double down. You chose to use that word again. You chose to arrest me on false charges. Remember that you made those choices. Remember that everything that happens from this point forward is because you couldn't show basic respect to someone who would have left you alone if you just acknowledged that using racial slurs has consequences." O'Brien and Walsh arrested Frank Lucas on that corner at 9:24 p.m., Friday, August 9th, 1968. They handcuffed him, put him in their police car, drove him to the precinct station, booked him on charges of threatening a police officer and obstruction of justice. Charges that were essentially fabricated, that had no basis beyond O'Brien's assertion that Lucas's countdown had constituted a threat, that would almost certainly be dismissed by any judge who examined the circumstances. Lucas was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, placed in a holding cell, and held overnight pending arraignment on Monday morning. The charges were indeed dismissed by a judge who recognized them as retaliatory arrest without legitimate probable cause, who told prosecutors that arresting someone for counting to 10 didn't constitute threatening an officer, and that obstruction charges required actual obstruction of legitimate police duties rather than just refusing to submit to harassment. Lucas was released Monday afternoon, having spent approximately 40 hours in jail, having been subjected to the deliberate humiliation of arrest and processing, and being held in a cell like a common criminal rather than like someone whose wealth and power should have insulated him from such treatment. Lucas left the courthouse understanding that Sergeant O'Brien had made this personal, had used racial slurs publicly, had arrested him on false charges, had treated him with contempt that demanded response far beyond anything Lucas had previously inflicted on people who disrespected him. But what happened next wasn't immediate retaliation. Lucas didn't order O'Brien killed, didn't send people to attack him, didn't respond with the kind of direct violence that everyone expected. Instead, Lucas did something far more sophisticated, far more devastating, something that would send a message not just to O'Brien, but to every police officer in Harlem. That would demonstrate power that went beyond simple criminal violence into territory of controlling entire neighborhoods through mechanisms that the police couldn't prevent or respond to. Monday evening, August 12, 1968, approximately 60 hours after Lucas's arrest, Harlem went silent. Not literally silent. People still moved through the streets. Music still played. Life continued. But the criminal activity that normally filled Harlem's corners and alleys and bars stopped completely. Drug dealers weren't on corners. Prostitutes weren't working their usual locations. Numbers runners weren't collecting bets. Stolen goods weren't being sold from storefronts and car trunks. Every form of street crime that normally operated openly in Harlem simply ceased as if someone had thrown a switch. The police noticed immediately. Officers on patrol found corners that were usually crowded with dealers completely empty. Locations that normally required constant police attention were quiet. The usual pattern of arrests and confrontations and small-scale enforcement that characterized Harlem policing stopped because there was nothing to enforce, no one to arrest, no visible criminal activity occurring anywhere that police could observe. At first, the police thought this was positive. Crime was down. The streets were quiet. Maybe their increased enforcement efforts were working. Maybe criminals were finally learning that Harlem wasn't going to tolerate open drug dealing and prostitution and other offenses. But by Tuesday evening, August 13th, when the silence continued, when the streets remained empty of criminal activity for a second consecutive night, the police began to understand that something else was happening, that this wasn't criminals voluntarily stopping their operations, but was instead something coordinated, something organized, something that suggested a level of control over Harlem's criminal ecosystem that police hadn't fully understood existed. By Wednesday, August 14th, The message became clear when informants started reporting what was happening. When word spread throughout the NYPD about what Frank Lucas had done in response to his arrest and public humiliation. Lucas had ordered every criminal operation he controlled, which was essentially all drug distribution in Harlem, and significant portions of other criminal activities, to cease operations completely. No drugs sold, no crimes committed, nothing that would give police any reason to make arrests or to claim they were controlling crime in Harlem. But the order came with specific conditions. Criminal operations would resume immediately if Sergeant O'Brien was transferred out of Harlem permanently. If O'Brien was reassigned to a different precinct, a different neighborhood, anywhere that wasn't Harlem, then Lucas would allow normal operations to continue. But as long as O'Brien remained assigned to Harlem, as long as the officer who'd used racial slurs and made false arrest remained on patrol in Lucas's territory, the streets would remain silent, crime would remain invisible, and police would have nothing to do except patrol empty corners while their arrest statistics plummeted and their superiors demanded explanations for why crime had suddenly disappeared from one of New York's highest crime neighborhoods. The pressure on the NYPD was immediate and intense. Supervisors demanded to know why crime statistics had dropped to zero in Harlem. Politicians called, asking why the streets were so quiet, when just days earlier they'd been demanding more aggressive policing. Other officers resented O'Brien for creating a situation where their work had become impossible, where they couldn't make arrests because criminals had been ordered to cease operations until O'Brien was removed. But more than just professional pressure, there was something deeply unsettling about what Lucas had accomplished. He demonstrated that he controlled Harlem more completely than the police did, that he could turn crime on and off like a switch, that criminal activity in the neighborhood operated at his discretion rather than occurring despite police enforcement. The silence of the streets was more frightening than the usual noise and chaos of criminal activity because it proved that Lucas had organizational control and community power that exceeded anything the police could muster. The NYPD held out for 5 days. 5 days of silent streets. 5 days of zero arrests. 5 days of Lucas demonstrating that he controlled Harlem in ways that made police presence largely irrelevant. Finally, on Sunday, August 18th, 1968, 9 days after the original confrontation, Sergeant Michael O'Brien was transferred to a precinct in Queens, officially for operational efficiency, but actually because the NYPD had no choice except to comply with Lucas's demand, or accept that one of their highest crime neighborhoods would remain crime-free and therefore require no policing, indefinitely. Within hours of O'Brien's transfer becoming public knowledge, Harlem returned to normal. Drug dealers returned to corners. Prostitutes resumed working. Numbers runners collected bets. Stolen goods appeared in storefronts. The criminal ecosystem that had been dormant for 9 days reactivated immediately, and police resumed making arrests and conducting enforcement that had been impossible during the silence. The message Lucas had sent was unmistakable and unprecedented. He'd proven that disrespecting him carried consequences that went beyond individual retaliation, that using racial slurs and making false arrests wouldn't be answered with violence against the officers involved, but instead with demonstrations of power that humiliated the entire police department by showing that Lucas could control whether crime occurred in Harlem, that police authority was subordinate to Lucas's organizational control, that the NYPD couldn't function in Harlem without Lucas's cooperation. For Sergeant O'Brien, personally, the transfer was devastating. He'd been publicly humiliated, forced to leave his assignment because a criminal had demanded it, marked as someone whose presence created problems that his superiors couldn't solve. O'Brien's career never recovered. He remained in the NYPD, but never received promotions, was eventually forced into early retirement, spent the rest of his life understanding that his decision to use racial slurs against Frank Lucas had ended his career more effectively than any formal disciplinary action could have. For the NYPD more broadly, the incident demonstrated limits of police authority in neighborhoods where organized criminals had deep community roots and sophisticated organizational structures. The police could arrest individual criminals, could conduct raids on specific operations, but they couldn't control neighborhoods where residents were more loyal to local power structures than to law enforcement that was viewed as occupying force rather than as protective service. The incident also revealed something about Lucas's strategic thinking that went beyond normal criminal violence. Lucas understood that killing police officers would bring massive retaliation, that attacking O'Brien directly would trigger responses that could destroy his entire operation. But ordering his organization to cease operations temporarily, demonstrating that crime in Harlem occurred at his discretion rather than despite police enforcement, sent a more powerful message than violence could have sent. That Lucas controlled the neighborhood more completely than the police did, that his power was institutional rather than just personal. That disrespecting him meant confronting not just one man, but an entire organizational structure that could make the police irrelevant by simply stopping the criminal activity that justified police presence. Friday night, August 9th, 1968, on the corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue in Harlem, the Night Sergeant Michael O'Brien used racial slurs against Frank Lucas, arrested him on false charges, publicly humiliated him in front of dozens of witnesses. The arrest that should have demonstrated police authority, but instead triggered 9 days of silence that proved Lucas controlled Harlem more completely than the NYPD ever could. The streets that went silent, not through police enforcement, but through criminal order. The message that was sent without violence, but with something more powerful. Demonstration that one man could turn crime on and off like a switch. That police authority in Harlem was contingent on Lucas's cooperation. That disrespecting him meant facing consequences that humiliated entire institutions rather than just individual officers. August 9th through August 18th, 1968. 9 days when Harlem's criminal ecosystem stopped functioning, when police found themselves patrolling empty corners, when arrest statistics dropped to zero, when the NYPD was forced to choose between keeping one sergeant in Harlem or accepting that the neighborhood's crime would remain invisible as long as he stayed. 9 days that ended with O'Brien's transfer and with the immediate resumption of normal criminal activity, proving that the silence had been deliberate, controlled, a demonstration of power rather than a spontaneous change in criminal behavior. The incident that shocked New York, not because of violence, but because of its absence. Not because criminals fought police, but because they simply stopped operating until police complied with demands that couldn't be ignored. Not because anyone was killed, but because an entire neighborhood's criminal ecosystem was temporarily shut down to prove a point about who actually controlled the streets, and what happened when police officers forgot that power came in forms beyond just legal authority and official badges. The night Sergeant O'Brien used racial slurs and made false arrest. The 9 days when Harlem went silent in response. The transfer that ended the silence and proved that Frank Lucas controlled the neighborhood more completely than the NYPD could ever hope to control it. August 1968, when disrespect demanded a response, and that response demonstrated power that went beyond violence into territory of institutional control and community loyalty that no amount of police enforcement could overcome. That was what happened when white cops humiliated Frank Lucas. Not immediate violence, not direct retaliation, but something more sophisticated and more devastating. 9 days of silence that proved who actually controlled Harlem and what happened when police authority collided with criminal power that was rooted in community rather than just in violence and fear.